America invaded Russia in 1918. Yeah, that's the intro. Let's get into it. Russia has had a bit of a strange history with the world wars. The Russians never could seem to be fully on either side. Sure, they fought the Germans for years during World War II, but before that, they invaded Poland with the Germans. World War I was even stranger though. The Russians fought for the Allied side, but were kind of fighting over here, while pretty much everyone else was over here. So for a lot of it, they were kind of doing their own thing. But then the Russians quit the game. On March the 3rd, 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest. I forgot to look this up. It's that, which basically gave Germany like a quarter of Russia's population and most of their coal mines, which, as you know, Russia is very fond of their coal mines. But why did Russia surrender to Germany? Well, there were two main reasons. Number one, the Russians were poor and had far fewer weapons. This led to the analogy of Russians having to like share one gun and have another person pick up the one single bolt action after his friend died. And after the failed Kerensky offensive, which led to 50,000 dead or wounded Russians and another 50,000 deserters, Germany and its allies were in a great position to invade Russia, and no, not during the winter. The second reason that the Russians surrendered was a little situation going on within Russia's government. Put simply, Russia until 1917 had a monarch known as the Tsar, who was basically like the king of the Russians and had absolute power and was kind of a bad guy, yada yada. You know how it is with kings, especially if you're a red-blooded American who hates kings and loves Tea Party. Anyway, in 1917, a major revolution occurred in Russia, which led to the Tsar abdicating his throne. A provisional democratic government was set up in Russia in his stead. However, a certain Bolshevik party was also picking up steam and was led by a guy you probably know named Vladimir Lenin. Bolshevik propaganda was a big reason why so many people were deserting the Russian army. This movement culminated in another uprising against the provisional government who did the first one by the Bolsheviks in October of 1917, leading to the socialists taking over the country, sorta. But we'll get into why they didn't really take over the country completely later. After some apparently really bad negotiating on the part of the Russians, the aforementioned this treaty was signed. The other allied countries were still fighting the Germans, so they were understandably pretty pissed off that the Russians had given up on the war. The allies had supported Russia under the Tsar and under the provisional government, but they would not be supporting this new socialist-led government that had given up on them. World War I ended in November of 1918, less than a year after the Russians gave up. Funnily enough, all that territory the Russians had given to the Germans was immediately given back after the war ended, since the Allies had, of course, won the war against the Germans. You guys already hopefully knew that. This would lead to the Allies directly supporting the enemies of the Bolsheviks, known as the White Movement. The White Movement was literally anyone who wasn't a communist, which were monarchists, liberals, conservatives, nationalists, and even former members of the Russian Imperial Army. This movement began soon after the Bolsheviks, or Reds, took power from the provisional government, leading of course to the Russian Civil War. The White Movement used this flag, which you may recognize. This movement was weird because they didn't really have any agreement on what they stood for, other than they don't like communism. Some factions in the White Movement were well, they were bad, we'll just say. But to the Allies, of course, the old saying of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Enemy number one was, of course, the party who overthrew the provisional government and surrendered during the final year of World War I. So who sided with the whites to invade Russia? Well, on the side of the Bolsheviks, we have the Russian Soviets, the Far Eastern Republic, the Latvian SSR, and the Ukrainian SSR. Now, on the side of the whites, we have the White Movement, the Czechoslovak Legion, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, the United States, France, Japan, Poland, Greece, Estonia, Serbia, Italy, China, Latvia, and Romania. Come outside, Lenin. We aren't going to jump you. Initially, the Allied forces were in Russian territory before the end of the war to stop Germans from taking Russian military equipment and to help Allied forces get out of Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. However, after the November 11th armistice ended fighting on the Western Front, the Allies decided they weren't done with Russia. Allied forces arrived in a wide number of areas within Russia, with small skirmishes between British troops and Red Army troops occurring in early 1918. The Allies would assist the White Army in small battles where possible, but this really started to ramp up when on September 4th, 1918, 3 battalions of 1,500 troops arrived in Archangel, which is right here. The British had helped the Whites in a military coup to take the city of Archangel, as it was an important strategic position in the area. The British and Whites fought the Reds at the cross between the Vaga and northern Divina rivers here. After taking this junction, they moved towards that place, but were unable to take it due to their lack of enough resources. The Americans and the Allies in the area were mostly inactive during the winter, especially after 27 of them were killed due to a surprise attack here near the town of Topsa. Funnily enough, when white movement Russians were sent into combat against the Reds by the Allies during the winter, many of the troops either defected or mutinied, and they were shot by the Allies. As winter came to a close, though, Bolshevik counterattacks began to be conducted to take back the land the British and Americans had taken. The British realized they didn't have the manpower to keep the Bolsheviks from taking back Allied territory and tried to recruit an actual white army in the area. However, the Allies failed to get many conscripts and decided to move towards somewhere with a larger population. Heading south and taking the town of Segeha. After a large battle, the Allies were able to kill many of the Red soldiers garrisoned there and secure a huge amount of territory. The furthest the Allies were able to get was the city of Shenkursk, but this is when the Bolsheviks would really begin to win against the Allied forces. In January 1919, the Bolsheviks shelled the British with poison gas, which is not very nice. The British media ran with that, and to be fair, poison gas is pretty bad. But this was right after World War I, so they probably had plenty of chemical weapons lying around, because World War I, they liked to do that in World War I. Shenkursk was hit with a massive counterattack by the Bolsheviks, forcing the RAF to conduct bombing missions to weaken them while the Allies fled the city. This would mark the beginning of the end. As with more mutinies and defections of white movement soldiers, the remaining Allied troops took up defensive positions and waited for the orders to be sent home. In June, the French, Canadians, and Americans left, and many more would leave over the following weeks. The British, however, stuck around in some areas, even continuing to fight for some reason. I don't know why, because the Americans and everybody else barely fought anybody, but the British loved to fight everybody during this invasion. Either way, with white soldiers defecting to the Reds left and right, the British basically were fighting everybody and had to leave, with Bolshevik forces destroying bridges and railways to slow their retreat. In the end, the Allied forces simply were far too small to perform a large-scale invasion, and they were hoping to capitalize on an already ongoing civil war to gain soldiers from the Whites, and obviously it didn't end up going too well, as they ended up losing nearly everything they took during their campaign. Over the following years after the Allies left Russia, the Bolsheviks solidified their power over the Russian Empire and created the modern-day Soviet Union. While the Russians did end up siding with the Allies, it's pretty clear that they never really got along. Soviet propaganda would use this event against the Americans for decades, underplaying the fact that during the Russian famine of 1921 and 1922, the Americans had provided the Russians with huge amounts of food that saved possibly millions of people from starvation. However, the Americans treated the Soviets just as harshly in their own media. The Soviets were also left completely in the dark about the American atomic bomb Manhattan Project during World War II. The Allies did send convoys of supplies to the Soviets during some of their worst engagements with the Germans, including that time where the Germans committed the largest war crime ever, and if you'd like to see a video on that, let me know. Anyways, subscribe if you're new, but I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.